You are welcome to yet another episode of HN What's Your Say? The #1 listening show, where we discuss real issues with real people like you. We are still featuring R. Kelly. Real name Robert Sylvester Kelly. Also known as the R&B King. When people hear the term trafficking, they immediately think of force, coercion, abduction or exploitation. And that's not surprising because that's how international law and most national laws actually define it. Trafficking under instruments like the Palermo Protocol requires 3 essential elements: the act, such as recruitment or transportation, the means, like force, fraud or coercion, and the purpose, which is usually exploitation. Without those elements, a consensual adult relationship simply does not qualify as trafficking. So here's the first crucial point in R. Kelly's defense. A consensual love affair between 2 adults of sound mind does not in itself amount to trafficking. That's not opinion. That's law. If 2 adults agree to date, to travel, to see one another and to have intimacy, the law recognizes that as consent and not as a crime. Yet in the prosecution of R. Kelly, the term trafficking was applied even in situations involving women like Faith Rogers. An adult woman capable of making her own choices. How did we get there? The answer lies in the use of an old federal law also known to facilitate systemic racism from its past application. And that's the Mann Act, which was passed in 1910. Originally called the White Slave Traffic Act, the Mann Act was designed to target forced prostitution. But over the years, it was broadened to criminalize transporting someone across state lines for any sexual activity for which any person can be charged with a crime. Notice the wording carefully. The law is not about consent. It's about whether the purpose of the travel was to engage in sexual conduct that the law considers unlawful. Fine. In Faith Rogers' case, prosecutors argued that Kelly transported her across state lines to engage in sexual activity without disclosing his STD status. In some states, knowingly exposing another person to herpes without disclosure can be a crime. That gave the government a hook. They claimed that the purpose of the travel itself was unlawful, even though the relationship appeared consensual. But here's the problem. The law requires that the unlawful intent exists at the time of transportation. It's not enough to say that later during intimacy, something unlawful happened. The Mann Act is therefore triggered at the transportation stage. So how do prosecutors prove intent at the moment of travel? In Kelly's case, they relied on a concept known as pattern evidence. They argued that because multiple women claimed he did not disclose his STD status, this proved that his intent every time he arranged for interstate travel was to conceal. But does a pattern really prove intent? Let's think carefully. Imagine a couple who always plan to use protection. They buy condoms before meeting up. The intent is clear. Safe sex. But in the heat of the moment they abandon that plan. Not once, not twice but several times. Over time, you see a pattern of unsafe sex. But does that mean they never intended to use condoms in the first place? Of course not. The repeated failure to follow through does not erase the original intent. It just shows that intentions and actions don't always align when emotions run high. Now apply that logic back to Kelly's situation. A person might very well plan to disclose their STD status face-to-face, rather than over the phone because they feel it's more respectful and private. I mean, who wants to declare their health status over a casual phone call or on WhatsApp? That intent at the planning stage is lawful. But later in the moment, they lose the courage. They fail to disclose. That failure may create legal consequences under state health laws, but it does not transform the original travel into a federal trafficking crime. Why? Because the unlawful purpose wasn't there when the travel was arranged. This distinction matters. The Mann Act was not written to police what happens during sex. It was written to criminalize transporting people for the primary purpose of unlawful engagements. If the intent to conceal arose only after travel, which the defense can argue, then the Mann Act does not apply. And this is where critics say the prosecution of R. Kelly stretched the law. By leaning on pattern evidence, the government invited the jury to assume that every single instance of travel must have been unlawful simply because non-disclosure occurred later. That's inference stacked on inference. It collapses the crucial distinction between intent at the transportation stage and actions during intimacy. In other words, the jury was asked to accept a shortcut, that a repeated outcome automatically proves prior unlawful intent. But law doesn't and shouldn't work that way. Let's go back to the condom analogy for a moment because it's powerful. Repeated failure to use protection might show recklessness. It might even show irresponsibility. But unless you can prove the intent was never there in the first place, you cannot honestly say the person always planned to have unprotected sex. The same principle applies to disclosure. Repeated failure to disclose an STD status could reflect fear, shame or hesitation and momentary failures of courage, but not necessarily proof of a deliberate plan from the start. Without clear evidence of intent formed at the time of transportation, the Mann Act charge doesn't hold. That's why the label of trafficking in this case feels misplaced. Traditional trafficking cases involve force, coercion, trickery or fraud. Elements completely absent in a consensual relationship between two adults. By stretching the Mann Act to cover situations like this, prosecutors blurred the line between genuine trafficking and flawed but consensual relationships. And this stretching is not just a problem for R. Kelly. It sets a dangerous precedent. If a pattern of non-disclosure can be used to retroactively criminalize interstate travel, then any adult with an STD who struggles with disclosure could face federal charges even in the context of a consensual romance. That's a chilling prospect. The proper way to handle non-disclosure is through state laws that specifically address health risks and consent in sexual relationships. These laws recognize that the key moment is disclosure before intimacy and not before travel. They do not confuse the lawful choice to date or to travel with the unlawful failure to disclose later on. By shifting the focus to the transportation stage, the government expanded the reach of federal law into areas it was never meant to cover. And in doing so, it risked criminalizing ordinary human relationships. Relationships that, while imperfect, were not trafficking by any stretch of the imagination. So let's come full circle. A consensual adult love affair that involves travel is not trafficking. Failing to disclose an STD before intimacy may raise issues under state law, but it is not in itself proof of unlawful intent at the time of travel. Patterns of behavior may raise suspicions, but they cannot substitute for clear evidence of intent. In R. Kelly's case, the defense argument is simple: the Mann Act was misapplied. The government failed to prove that unlawful intent existed at the transportation stage. Instead, they invited the jury to assume it based on later actions and on a pattern that could just as easily be explained by human hesitation rather than criminal design. And when the law is stretched this far, it loses its meaning. Trafficking should mean what it has always meant: force, coercion or exploitation. Not consensual adult relationships clouded by fear, mistakes or bad judgment. At the end of the day, the question is not whether R. Kelly was perfect. No one is arguing that. The question is whether the government proved what the Mann Act actually requires. That at the time of arranging transportation, the purpose was unlawful. And on that point, the evidence simply does not hold. That is the essence of the defense. That is why the Mann Act charge in this case should be viewed as an overreach. And that is why labeling a consensual adult relationship as trafficking is not just a mischaracterization but a miscarriage of justice. That is all we had for you today on HN What's Your Say? To keep updated whenever we post a new video, subscribe to this channel now. Also remember to hit the bell icon and enable notifications. And feel free to share your opinions with us in the comment section below, and let us know if you would like us to publish your views in our next release. We value all our subscribers' opinions.